Welcome to the launching of my latest book, Resistance, Refuge and Revival, the Indigenous Kalinagos of Dominica. It's the result of my doctoral thesis, which I did quite some years ago at Oxford University, and which I have revised, adapted to a general readership book. And essentially it tells of the over 500-year story of the Kalinago people in Dominica and within the sub-region of the Caribbean, mainly the Lesser Antilles, ranging from the Orinoco Delta in South America and going all up the way towards Puerto Rico and some of the other Greater Antilles Islands. So what I'll be doing, for those of you all who are interested in the outline of the book, I'll be basically giving a synopsis of what is in the book, and basically through the objects that I talk about in the various chapters of the book. What we must understand is that when you're researching such a thing, although I was doing a thesis in anthropology, that this particular story is a combination of really history and the analysis of tribal society and what they made of it over a 500-year period of colonization into sovereignty and independence. So essentially it combines a number of disciplines. It combines archaeology, anthropology in understanding the surviving myths or the recorded myths and accounts by various travelers and even some of the early anthropologists in the late 19th and early 20th century. It also involves the reading in detail of ships' logs, including that of Columbus and the accounts that were written by his son, Ferdinand, about his arrival in Dominica and subsequent relationships that emerged. Also, the logs of those other European sailors, particularly from England, France, and the Dutch, who arrived to challenge the Spanish occupation of these islands and to claim, first of all, the lands against Spanish ownership, to establish colonies themselves, and to a certain extent giving accounts of their relationships with the Kalinago people. Now, particularly in the case of Dominica, we have a vast canvas, because Dominica essentially was the last of the islands in the Caribbean to be colonized officially. Yes, French and Africans and eventually the English did take over the island bit by bit in an informal way. But essentially full colonization by international law at the time began in 1763 by the Treaty of Paris, when Dominica was ceded to the British. And the accounts that we get throughout that period, and then the accounts that we have of the establishment of one key area in this whole story, which is the Kalinago territory as it is called now, and when it was founded in 1903, called the Carib Reserve. Now, that requires a great deal of colonial research, that is research of governors and House of Assembly, correspondence with British Secretaries of State in the Colonial Office and all of that. So you can see for yourself that it is a very varied combination of sources. And that includes also things like botany and the ethnobotany of the Kalinago people over time, and the way in which they used and their knowledge of the material culture, the natural vegetation of the island, and the way in which these traditions had been handed down or had been lost. So let us first go to the Orinoco, that river valley that comes down from the Andes up behind Colombia and through what is today Venezuela and Guyana. And we begin our story in an area that today is called Saladero, because that is where the material culture that we begin to study starts, in terms of the saladoid pottery that was first introduced to these islands about the time of the Christian era, when they arrived down at the coast facing Trinidad in BC. I'll go and use the traditional dating, about 200 BC. And that is when we get the evidence of the pottery, which then we follow as the people travel up the islands. Now, there were people before that time. We're going back in that region to about 500 BC, when hunter-gatherers came up the islands across the Trinidad, which was far closer to because of the sea level, it was far closer, and at one time had actually joined with the Orinoco, so you could walk through the swampy lands across to Trinidad. And then from Trinidad, you would naturally be able to go across to Tobago, and from there, from Tobago, you could sight if not the island itself, but the clouds building up above the island of what became known as Grenada. And from Grenada, it was basically a simple matter all the way up to the Anegada Passage, which separates the volcanic Lesser Antilles from the Virgin Islands as they are today, and then on into Puerto Rico. And this is identified, as I said, by the pottery. We have a few pieces here, and what I'll be doing as we continue is to show various aspects and evidence of this passage through history. So we have, for instance, pieces of saladoid pottery, just little bits and pieces that have been found in sites across Dominica. You have now, we have been able to locate 113 archaeological sites, dotted mainly along the coast, but some of them are up into the interior. And these adornos are basically the pretty bits. There's a lot of other shards of pottery that may not be so interesting, but they are important to understanding the overall design of some of these artifacts. So we have these adornos, most of which are representing the heads of various animals. Some of them you can identify. For instance, we have this one here, which would be a head of a turtle. And people, of course, argue and attempt to identify what type of turtle it was. Turtles were very prevalent on the islands. And then you have a seabird here. Could be a pelican, could be another type of heron. All of these birds were very prevalent, very recognized within the society that we're talking about. Now, these adornos essentially used to go at the end of, I'm using a model of a pot here, and this has been remade to simulate a pot that was broken, and the artisan has put it together in recent times. But it gives you an idea of the adornos and the positioning as more or less handles within it. And here, for instance, is another turtle. Of course, you can understand with the prevalence of turtles around the place, turtles featured quite a lot, but also birds. Now, in coming up through the islands, they were entering, in effect, a new world. They were leaving the freshwater, muddy delta of the Orinoco region, and once they passed Tobago and entered into the Grenada and the Grenadines, they were into a new coral world, a world of coral reefs and also volcanic peaks. And one of the main things that they cited and used for a number of purposes was the queen conch, the Strombus gigas. And from the queen conch, they were able to get very protein-rich food from the inside, bringing it out and using it for their various different dishes, but also very useful for making tools. So, for instance, this whole lip here can be cut out and then be molded, worn, and used as a tool, either to attach to a piece of wood or to use in your hand and to scrape. What was also of interest to them were these spikes, these pitons, these peaks. And that was another thing that they saw as they came up the islands. These volcanic peaks with hot springs and boiling lakes that they had not experienced back on the continent. And so these made a very important impact. And it was often thought that below, by using the conch as a sort of, symbol of these peaks, we see the beginning of a development down in the islands of using these peaks as sort of some religious object. This is always still being heavily debated, but by cutting off the peaks, it has a space underneath. They would carve them a bit and use them in various ways associated with interpreting their world, their new world that they were entering on the islands. And we have a small model of what these developed into. So here you have this zimi. Zimi was a religious object, and it could, most people say, it is representing the volcanic peaks and the volcano and the fertile soil, and that everything came from these fertile islands that they passed or they settled in as they went up. So you see the image of the spirits down here, and then the space which you would have seen in the conch shell, in the base of the conch shell, and replicated. This is made of clay, but there are much bigger ones. In fact, in the case of Dominica, there's a splendid zimi of this type. It's 41 centimeters in length and about 22 centimeters in height, so it's pretty large, carved off volcanic rock. This was found in a cave at Soufriere in the southern village on the southwest coast of Dominica. When the church of Soufriere, which still stands, when the church was being built in 1878. And the object was taken to the parish priest, and he sent it to Paris, and the person who he sent it to handed it to the ethnographic museum, the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and now it sits in another museum, ethnographic museum in Paris, where it is on display. And there has been a recent exhibition on the Taino and Kalinago people, which features this object very prominently. So we know that it was active in Dominica. There's a big debate as to whether it was brought from the Greater Antilles, because it looks like the Taino culture, and brought to Dominica, or whether the Kalinagos imitated that type of carving for their representation in Dominica, or whether the Kalinagos actually raided places like Puerto Rico and brought these objects down, because we also have a wooden seat, and that's in the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. It's stored in the offices there, and that was sent also from Dominica, in this case, to Britain. So there are all of these objects scattered really around mainly the Caribbean and the world, focused, of course, on the colonial powers, France and England. So besides all of this, besides the pottery, what we have in Dominica, we've been able to find, is a lot of stone tools, because really these were Stone Age people. You had the hunter-gatherers at first, but then they were replaced by the Saladoid people, named for Saladeo in what is today Venezuela, along the delta, and then those objects were brought up the islands and they were identified. And as the culture changed, so did the pottery change. So we see other types and styles of pottery going up the islands. In the book, you will see a whole list of them, places like Barancoid, Trumasoid, and Suezoid, and the last, the Caillou type of pottery. Very simple, very unadorned type of pottery for the Caillou, and that's what is identified with the Kalinago people. But while all of this was going on, of course, they had no metal. They had no steel or anything of that nature. And so they made these stone tools. All of these tools have been found in Dominica, this one in the area of Portsmouth, Portsmouth, here at Bioche on the west coast, places like Canefield, Calibichy. So all of these objects. But once the Europeans arrived, we find that they actually are changing, because the Europeans are bringing iron axes and trading them for things that they want from the Kalinago people, mainly tobacco. And that is where this contact with Columbus arriving on his second voyage. I'm on the north coast of Dominica as we speak, arriving off the north coast of Dominica, and that whole cycle begins. And you will be able to read it in the early chapters of the book. And gradually, as colonization developed, and as I said, the British take over in 1763, the indigenous people then have to move further and further away from where all of their lands are being taken from them, particularly after 1763, for cutting and clearing the forest along the coast up into about 2 miles to the interior and planting sugarcane. And once the sugarcane came, that meant the whole forest had to go. And so the indigenous people moved further and further away to the most rugged corner of the island, where the Kalinago territory is today. But up in that area, they attempted to maintain their traditional skills, and the skills that they could trade and were important to them. So for instance, their basket work that you see here with an inner section that is made waterproof by putting balisier, heliconia leaves, in between two different levels of basket work. So that was very important. It was sold. That's how the Kalinago people during the colonial times made money. And we can see examples of it from the Orinoco area and the way in which it was carried up the islands, just like the pottery styles. The other thing was the making of canoes. Canoes were extremely important to them. That is how they got across the island. Here are a couple miniatures, and there was a dugout here, and then they were added later on under the influence of European and African arrivals. They added ribs and a bordage, as they call it, an extra board to be able to go out into the Atlantic. And this remained the key boat of Dominica up into the, well into the 20th century, and some of them are still made. So this is covered in the book as well, the construction of the Kalinago canoe. I quickly have to move on to map making, in that the British produced these maps then of their new colony. And in the earliest maps, this one by Thomas Jeffries in 1765, we get some of the Kalinago names. So many of the names that still survive today: Calibichy, Coliho, Bataka, Salibia, and many, many more. And in the map, we found at the top here identification of a Kalinago village. And we have gone and looked for it and found evidence of its presence, and also a new departure that we have found in Dominica, and that is petroglyphs, that is rock carvings. And these, that is the only place in Dominica, up in Grand Fort in the extreme north of Dominica by Reposoir, that they have found it. Other important aspects of the evidence is the language. This is a modern book based on a book by Father Raymond Breton, who lived among the Kalinago people, and he recorded their language. So this book, a Dictionnaire Français Caribe by Breton, is very, very important. Our other important source is Père Labat. He was a priest of the Dominican order, and in this we get a lot of information, because once again he came to Dominica, he lived in Guadeloupe and Martinique, and he provides a great deal of information, and also illustrations and maps of various islands. So we get all these fantastic records. All of this is used towards it. And then at the end of the 19th century, we also have another important map, and this is the map, which is of the Kalinago territory, the Carib Reserve, that one civil servant, Hesketh Bell, decides he is going to provide some 3,700 acres so that the last of the Kalinago can have some land of their own. And it's the only place in the Caribbean where the indigenous people have been granted back, small as it may be, an area of land. All of this was done by Hesketh Bell. You can see a very prominent colonial official, and he is the one that created the Kalinago territory, as it is now called. The problems, of course, did not end there, and there was contention between the colonial powers and the Kalinagos over restrictions of their traditional use and movement up and down the islands. The colonials wanted to make boundaries and raise taxes through custom duties. Now the Kalinagos in 1930, actually the 19th of September 1930, reacted against this. The British sent a warship, the HMS Delhi. There was confrontation. Two of the Kalinagos were killed. There was a commission of inquiry, and this really was one of the things that began the revival of the Kalinago people as they decided to take their affairs into their own hands and challenge the colonial powers. And so we move up into the ending of the book, where we get to the point where there is a representation in Parliament for the Kalinago people, by the Kalinago people. The important legislation that was made just before independence of Dominica in 1978, that is the Kalinago Act, which basically oversees the election of the chief, the councillors, and the management of the territory. And in the last chapter, we have the appointment of the first Kalinago woman president, head of state of Dominica, Her Excellency Sylvanie Burton. And as we go on, we also have had, within the last month or more, the election of the first female Kalinago chief, Chief Annette Sanford. And so you can see in this quick little synopsis the variety that is contained within that book, which I hope you will read, enjoy, and be informed. Thank you.